from the Wiltshire, Gloucestershire Standard, on Saturday the 17th of October, 1908. Albert Edward Freegard, aged 35, a labourer, was indicted for feloniously wounding and causing grievous bodily harm to his wife Jane Freegard with intent to murder her at Crudwell on May 26. Mr. Thornton Laws appeared for the prosecution and Mr. R.G. Seaton defended. Mr. Thornton Laws outlined the case for the prosecution. The wife was living at Wootton Bassett, and having obtained work at Crudwell, the prisoner went with another man to Wootton Bassett, driving a pair horse wagon to fetch his wife and the furniture. The alleged offence was said to have been committed between the two places.
My name is George Sluggs. I am a carter for Mr. J.H. Large of Crudwell. I accompanied Albert Freegard in a two-horse wagon on the journey to Wootton Bassett on the 26th of May. We were going to fetch his wife and children and the furniture. When we got to the house, Mr. Freegard asked his wife if she had all the furniture ready. She said she hadn't, and that she hadn't received his letter until Sunday morning, and he hadn't sent any money to get the furniture there. We loaded up all the furniture there was at Wootton Bassett. Then Mr. Freegard began using bad language to his wife. He flung the furniture about as it was being put on the wagon. Then he had some beer, and Mrs. Freegard asked him to have no more of it. On the journey to Crudwell, we stopped at a public house in Brinkworth, and we had some refreshments. Going on to Long Newton, they began to quarrel about some old grievances. We stopped again at the Horse and Groom at Charlton, where Mr. Freegard had more drink. Then Mr. Freegard threatened to throw his wife out of the wagon, following a dispute about a pipe. Mrs. Freegard got down onto the shafts, and Mr. Freegard pushed her onto the road. She fell under the front wheel of the wagon, and I stopped the horses. Mr. Freegard began to beat his wife about, pushing her up under the hind wheel, and called out to the horses to go on, but I wouldn't let them proceed. The woman scrabbled into a ditch, and he kicked her several times on the head. He said he would kill her when they arrived. I got Mr. Freegard away and tried to drive away with him. I was frightened. I thought he would have killed her if I couldn't get him away. But then I had to stop because a trace came undone, and Mr. Freegard got down again and went back to his wife. I think he was beating her again. Eventually I drove on with the horses to a neighbouring farm and then went back to Mr. and Mrs. Freegard. I remonstrated with Mr. Freegard as to his conduct, but he replied that it was no odds to him. When we worked together, I knew him as a sober sort of man.
A member of the jury asked George Sluggs whether Mr. Freegard had been drinking.
He had had some beer, but he wasn't so drunk that he couldn't walk straight.
My name is Jane Freegard, the wife of the prisoner. Whilst my husband was away, I had to go to the workhouse, as I had no other means. My husband had 3 quarts of beer before we started, with the exception of 1 glass, which my sister had. He was the worse for beer when we started, and he could not walk straight. We had refreshments on the way. The assault began over a dispute about the loss of a pipe. I told him I didn't know where the pipe was, but he disagreed and said that I did. He threatened to throw me out of the wagon. Some time afterwards I had the cramp and dismounted the wagon. My husband caught hold of me and threatened to put my head under the wheel. He threw me on the ground, thumped me in the face, and kicked me in the jaw. I protected myself with my hands, as well as I could, but the kick made my jaw bleed, and one of my teeth was kicked out. I tried to get out of the ditch, but only sank further into the mud. My husband was swearing at me at the time and threatened to kill me. After walking along the road with him for some distance, we met a motor car, and I asked the driver the way to Malmesbury, as I wanted the police. The man said he would fetch them. Soon afterwards a policeman came, and I was taken to the hospital.
My name is Albert Hayes. I was cycling on the road when I passed the wagon and heard the prisoner and the woman quarrelling. Mr. Freegard was swearing and said he would kill her.
My name is Albert Buck. I am a chauffeur to the Earl of Suffolk. Mrs. Freegard stopped me on the road and appealed to me to fetch a policeman, and I drove off for one. Mrs. Freegard's face was covered with blood, and she was in a very distressed condition. She also had a young child in her arms.
I am Police Constable Kilford. When I was informed of the affair by Mr. Buck, I found the man and woman on the road. When I asked what was the matter, the woman replied, asking me to take her away. Her husband had tried to murder her, knocked her about the head, and broken her jaw, and she was afraid of him. Her eye was banged up, her face grazed, and her lip cut. I told Mr. Freegard that I would have to take him to Malmesbury, and whilst helping Mrs. Freegard along, she fainted. Leaving her on the roadside, I took Mr. Freegard along until I met a couple of grooms, with whose assistance, after much trouble, I handcuffed him. Mr. Freegard smelled of beer, but he was not drunk. After getting him to the police station and the woman to the hospital, I went back to the road, where I found a woman's waist belt and other articles of dress covered with blood. The next day I found a tooth in the hedge bottom.
My name is Dr. Pitt. I examined the woman in Malmesbury Cottage Hospital and found her suffering from a wound down to the bone, from the mouth to underneath the chin. Mrs. Freegard also had a cut over the left eye, a bruise on the left thigh, and a fractured collarbone. Her injuries were consistent with kicks or blows such as have been described.
Mr. Seaton, addressing the jury for the defence, argued that, although the man, whilst under the influence of drink, committed wrong, for which he ought to be punished, the offence did not amount to more than unlawful wounding. The jury found Albert Freegard guilty of wounding with intent to do grievous bodily harm. The judge spoke.
It would have been impossible for the jury today to have come to any other conclusion. The highest that the prisoner's counsel could say was that he was so drunk he did not know what he was doing. Unfortunately, both before and after the assault, he expressed his intention, in the hearing of witnesses, to kill the woman.
Then the prisoner spoke.
I never intended to kill her, my lord.
If anything had happened to your wife and she had died as a consequence of her wounds, you would have been guilty of murder. In my judgment, this is a serious case, a most serious case indeed. It is not to be borne that men should treat women in this way. She is your wife, to whom you have been married for 10 years, the mother of your children, and you treat her in this way, kicking her about the head and face, and put her head under the wheels of a wagon. It is a serious case, and the sentence I am going to pass is intended to be severe, as a warning to other people. There is far too much violence prevailing at the present time, and as far as I am concerned, such cases will always meet with heavy punishment. The sentence of the court is 3 years penal servitude.